Welcome, weary souls seeking wisdom and rest, to a journey through the gentle teachings of Uncle Iroh, the Fire Nation general who chose love over conquest, tea over warfare, and compassion over vengeance. Tonight, we walk beside the man whose greatest victories were won, not through flame and fury, but through patience, understanding, and the quiet strength that comes from a heart at peace. Let his words wash over you like steam rising from jasmine tea, each lesson a balm for troubled spirits. Settle yourself comfortably and allow the dragon of the West to guide you toward the tranquil shores of sleep. The morning sun filtered through the prison bars of Uncle Iroh's cell in the Fire Nation capital, casting gentle patterns across stone walls that had witnessed so much suffering, yet could not dim the light that emanated from the old man who sat in meditation within their confines. Even here, in this place designed to break spirits and crush hope, Iroh had found ways to cultivate wisdom, to tend the garden of his soul with the same careful attention he had once devoted to his beloved tea plants in the gardens of the Fire Nation Palace during more innocent times. Life happens wherever you are, whether you make it or not. These words, spoken to his nephew during one of their countless conversations, contained within them the essence of everything Iroh had learned through decades of living, loving, losing, and ultimately finding his way to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly alive. The lesson was not merely philosophical abstraction, but hard-won wisdom born from experience that had tested every assumption he had ever held about power, purpose, and the nature of strength itself. The man who sat in that prison cell was not the same person who had once commanded the Fire Nation's most elite military forces, who had laid siege to the great city of Ba Sing Se, with the confidence of someone who believed absolutely in the righteousness of his cause and the inevitability of his victory. That earlier version of Iroh had been a creature of certainty, convinced that wisdom was something that could be acquired through study and applied through force, that the world could be understood through the lens of Fire Nation superiority and shaped according to Fire Nation will. But life, as Iroh had discovered, has ways of teaching lessons that no military academy or royal tutor could ever provide. Lessons that arrive not through formal instruction, but through the raw experience of living, through moments of triumph and defeat, through the accumulation of small daily choices that gradually shape the soul until one day you wake up and realize you have become someone entirely different from who you once thought you were. The transformation had begun long before Lu Ten's death, though that tragedy would serve as the catalyst that finally shattered the comfortable illusions that had sustained him through years of what he had convinced himself was glorious service to his nation and his family legacy. It had begun in small moments during his military campaigns, glimpses of humanity that pierced through the armor of ideology and strategic thinking that generals are trained to wear like protective clothing against the moral complexities of warfare. He remembered the village children who had watched his army march through their streets, their eyes holding not hatred or fear, but simple curiosity about these strangers who had arrived with such impressive displays of power and organization. He remembered the Earth Kingdom farmers who had offered his soldiers water during a particularly brutal summer campaign. Their generosity extended even to those who represented everything they had reason to oppose. He remembered the Water Tribe healers who had tended to Fire Nation wounded with the same care they showed their own people, demonstrating a kind of strength that had nothing to do with the ability to inflict damage and everything to do with the courage required to preserve life, even when it would have been easier to let it slip away. These moments had planted seeds of doubt in soil that had been prepared by years of observing the actual consequences of the war he helped to prosecute. The gap between the glorious rhetoric that justified their actions and the grinding reality of what those actions produced in terms of human suffering and environmental destruction. The Fire Nation's mission to share its greatness with the world looked very different when viewed from the perspective of those who were being forcibly introduced to that greatness. When the sharing revealed itself to be a form of taking that left communities broken and landscapes scarred. But even these growing doubts might have remained manageable, relegated to the category of unfortunate but necessary costs of achieving greater goods, if not for the personal dimension that Lu Ten's death added to his understanding of what war actually meant. The abstract concept of casualties suddenly became devastatingly concrete. The strategic calculations that treated human lives as acceptable losses revealed themselves as moral failures of imagination and empathy that no amount of tactical success could justify or compensate. The grief that consumed Iroh following his son's death was unlike anything he had previously experienced, a pain so fundamental and all-encompassing that it stripped away every defense mechanism he had developed for maintaining emotional equilibrium in the face of life's inevitable challenges. The numbness that followed the initial shock gave way to anger, then to despair, then to a kind of emptiness that seemed to extend in all directions without limit or boundary, leaving him suspended in a void where none of his previous sources of meaning and purpose seemed capable of providing even the smallest measure of comfort or direction. It was in this state of complete spiritual collapse that Iroh began the slow, painful work of rebuilding his understanding of himself and the world from foundations that could support the weight of what he had learned about loss, responsibility, and the true cost of the choices that powerful people make on behalf of others who will bear the consequences of those decisions. The process required him to examine every assumption he had inherited about strength, honor, loyalty, and the proper relationship between individual desires and collective obligations. The first and perhaps most difficult lesson was accepting that wisdom cannot be imposed from outside but must be discovered through direct experience, that no amount of instruction or advice can substitute for the personal journey through confusion, mistake, and gradual understanding that constitutes genuine learning. This realization was particularly challenging for someone who had been trained to value expertise and efficiency, who had built his identity around the ability to analyze situations quickly and implement effective solutions through the application of superior knowledge and resources. But the death of his son had confronted him with a problem that could not be solved through any combination of military strategy, political maneuvering, or technological innovation. Lu Ten was gone, and no amount of power or wisdom could change that fundamental fact or ease the pain of loss through anything other than the slow, patient work of learning to carry grief without being destroyed by it, of finding ways to honor what had been lost without being paralyzed by regret over what could not be recovered. The tea ceremony that became such a central part of Iroh's daily practice during his years of wandering with Zuko was not merely a pleasant ritual or cultural affectation, but a carefully cultivated form of meditation that taught him to find meaning and satisfaction in the present moment, rather than constantly striving toward future goals or dwelling on past failures. The precise movements required for proper tea preparation demanded a kind of attention that left no room for the mental noise that usually filled consciousness, creating space for the kind of quiet observation that allows wisdom to emerge naturally from experience, rather than being forced through analysis or effort. Each cup of tea became a lesson in patience, in the understanding that some things cannot be rushed without being ruined, that the best results often come from accepting the natural timing of processes that unfold according to their own internal logic rather than external pressure or manipulation. The water had to reach the proper temperature. The leaves had to steep for exactly the right amount of time. The serving had to be conducted with attention and care. Any attempt to hurry these steps would produce inferior results, no matter how skilled the practitioner or how urgent the desire for completion. This understanding gradually extended beyond tea preparation to encompass his approach to teaching Zuko, to navigating the complex political situations they encountered during their travels, to responding to the various crises and challenges that arose during their journey toward redemption and reconciliation. The impatience that had once characterized his approach to problems was replaced by a deep trust in the wisdom of allowing situations to develop at their own pace, intervening only when intervention would be truly helpful, rather than simply satisfying his desire to be useful or his anxiety about outcomes beyond his control. The humility that this required was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his transformation. The recognition that his previous confidence in his own judgment and abilities had been based more on illusion than reality, that the respect and deference he had received as a Fire Nation general had more to do with his position and power than with any genuine wisdom or insight he possessed. Learning to approach each situation with curiosity rather than certainty, to ask questions rather than providing answers, to listen more than he spoke, required a fundamental reorientation of his relationship to his own intelligence and experience. But this humility proved to be the foundation for a much deeper and more authentic form of strength, one that came not from the ability to control others or impose his will on external circumstances, but from the inner peace and clarity that allowed him to respond to whatever arose with appropriate action, rather than reactive emotion. The general who had once commanded armies through fear and authority became the uncle who influenced hearts through love and example, demonstrating that true power comes not from what you can force others to do, but from who you inspire them to become. The wisdom that Iroh eventually embodied was not a possession that he had acquired through study or experience, but a way of being that emerged from his willingness to remain open to learning regardless of his age or previous achievements. He understood that life would continue to offer new lessons until the moment of death, that each day brought opportunities for growth and discovery, if approached with the proper attitude of receptivity and wonder. This understanding freed him from the burden of needing to have all the answers, allowing him to find joy in questions and comfort in uncertainty, to see mystery as invitation rather than problem to be solved. The influence that this transformed understanding had on those around him, particularly Zuko, demonstrated how authentic wisdom spreads not through preaching or instruction, but through the attractive power of genuine peace and contentment. People were drawn to Iroh not because he told them what to do, but because he embodied a way of being that they intuitively recognized as more satisfying and sustainable than their current approaches to living. His presence created space for others to discover their own wisdom. His questions invited them to explore their own hearts. His example showed them possibilities they had never imagined for themselves. As the years passed and Iroh's reputation as a wise man grew beyond the circles of those who knew him personally, he remained committed to the understanding that wisdom was not something he possessed, but something that flowed through him when he remained open to the deeper intelligence that pervades all existence. He saw himself not as a teacher in the conventional sense, but as a fellow student in the great school of life. Someone who had perhaps progressed a little further along certain paths, but was still learning, still growing, still capable of being surprised by the inexhaustible creativity and mystery of the universe he inhabited. This perspective kept him humble even as others began to treat him as a sage, prevented him from becoming attached to his reputation or defensive about his teachings, allowed him to continue evolving and adapting his understanding as new experiences provided fresh insights into the nature of reality and the human condition. The man who had once thought he knew everything about war and power discovered that the more he learned about peace and love, the more there was to discover, that wisdom was not a destination, but a journey that became more rewarding the longer it continued. The lessons that life had taught him through joy and sorrow, victory and defeat, love and loss, had transformed him from someone who tried to make life conform to his expectations into someone who danced with life as it actually was, finding beauty and meaning in whatever circumstances arose while working skillfully to reduce suffering and increase happiness wherever his influence could make a positive difference. This dance required constant attention and adjustment, moment-to-moment awareness of what was needed and what was possible, the kind of presence that can only be cultivated through years of practice in letting go of control while remaining fully engaged with whatever is happening right now. The iron bars of the prison cell could not contain the gentle revolution that had begun in Uncle Iroh's heart decades before his nephew ever stood before Fire Lord Ozai to reclaim his honor and his birthright. Within those stone walls, the old man who had once commanded the respect of armies through fear and superior firepower had discovered a different kind of strength entirely, one that required no weapons, demanded no submission, and grew more powerful the more freely it was given away to anyone who had the wisdom to recognize its value. Pride is not the opposite of shame, but its source. These words, spoken to Zuko during one of their many conversations about the nature of true strength, contained within them a complete philosophy of living that challenged every assumption their culture had taught them about what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be powerful, what it meant to command respect from others and maintain dignity in the face of adversity and loss. The lesson was particularly difficult for someone raised in the Fire Nation's militaristic culture, where strength was measured by the ability to dominate others and weakness was defined as anything that suggested vulnerability, uncertainty, or the need for help from anyone else. But Iroh had learned through the devastating experience of losing his son that the kind of strength their society celebrated was ultimately hollow, a brittle facade that crumbled under the weight of real suffering and left those who depended on it defenseless against the inevitable losses and disappointments that no amount of power or position could prevent. The general who had believed that victory in battle was the highest expression of human capability had discovered that the most important battles were fought within the human heart, where courage was measured not by the willingness to inflict pain, but by the capacity to remain open to love, even after experiencing the deepest possible wounds. The transformation had not happened overnight, nor had it been easy or comfortable for someone whose entire identity had been built around the traditional Fire Nation understanding of masculine virtue. Iroh had been raised to believe that emotions were weaknesses to be controlled or suppressed, that tears were signs of failure, that asking for help was admission of inadequacy, that the measure of a man was his ability to solve problems through force of will and superior strategy rather than through collaboration, patience, or the humble recognition that some challenges require wisdom beyond what any individual can provide. The young general who had laid siege to Ba Sing Se with such confidence and determination had embodied everything his culture taught about the proper way for men to move through the world. Decisive, aggressive, certain of his own judgment, willing to sacrifice whatever was necessary to achieve his objectives, contemptuous of weakness in himself or others, convinced that strength was a finite resource that could only be maintained by taking it from those who proved themselves unable to defend what was theirs. This understanding of masculinity was inseparable from the Fire Nation's imperial ambitions. The personal psychology that made conquest feel natural and justified, that allowed good men to participate in terrible acts without questioning the fundamental assumptions that made such acts seem necessary and even noble. But the death of Lu Ten had shattered this carefully constructed worldview in ways that no philosophical argument or moral lecture could have accomplished, forcing Iroh to confront the reality that all his strength, all his skill, All his determination and strategic brilliance had been powerless to protect the person who mattered most to him in all the world. The pain of this loss was so overwhelming that it stripped away every defense mechanism he had developed for maintaining the emotional control that Fire Nation culture demanded from its leaders, leaving him exposed to feelings that he had been taught to consider unworthy of a strong man. The grief that followed was unlike anything he had previously experienced, not just because of its intensity, but because of the way it revealed the inadequacy of everything he had been taught about how to respond to suffering. The military training that had prepared him to endure physical hardship and maintain composure under pressure was useless against the kind of pain that came from love rather than conflict, that could not be defeated or overcome but only carried, transformed, and eventually integrated into a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human in a world where loss was inevitable. And love was the only response that made such loss bearable. The first stage of his transformation involved learning to cry, not as a momentary release of overwhelming emotion, but as a regular practice of honoring his feelings rather than trying to control or suppress them. This was perhaps the most difficult lesson for someone who had been conditioned to see tears as shameful weakness, who had witnessed Ozai's cruel response to Zuko's emotional display during the Agni Kai that had scarred both the prince's face and his understanding of what it meant to show vulnerability in front of those whose approval he desperately needed. But Iroh discovered that tears were not weakness but a form of courage, the willingness to let his heart remain open even after it had been broken, to continue feeling deeply even when feeling led to pain that no amount of emotional armor could prevent or diminish. The ability to weep for what he had lost became the foundation for his capacity to love what remained, to appreciate beauty even in the midst of sorrow, to find meaning in suffering rather than trying to escape or deny it through the kind of numbness that his culture offered as an alternative to genuine emotional engagement. The contrast with Ozai's approach to masculine strength could not have been more complete or more instructive for anyone willing to observe the differences between these two models of how men might respond to the challenges and responsibilities of leadership. Where Ozai used fear and intimidation to maintain control, Iroh offered guidance and support that empowered others to discover their own capabilities. Where Ozai demanded absolute obedience based on his superior position and power, Iroh inspired loyalty through his genuine care for the well-being of those who chose to follow his example rather than his commands. The Fire Lord's understanding of strength was fundamentally based on scarcity, the belief that power was a finite resource that could only be maintained by hoarding it and preventing others from developing capabilities that might threaten his dominance. This worldview required constant vigilance against potential challenges, perpetual readiness to crush any sign of independence or questioning, the exhausting work of maintaining superiority through methods that ultimately isolated him from the very people whose respect and affection he claimed to deserve by virtue of his strength and position. Iroh's approach was based on abundance, the understanding that true strength grew stronger when shared, that power was most effective when it empowered others, rather than diminishing them, that the respect and love of others could not be commanded or demanded, but only earned through consistent demonstration of the qualities that inspired people to offer their trust and affection freely. This understanding freed him from the burden of needing to prove his worth through domination or competition, allowing him to find joy in the success of others and satisfaction in his ability to contribute to their growth and happiness. The difference between these two approaches was most clearly visible in their relationships with Zuko, whose struggles with identity and purpose provided a testing ground for competing philosophies of guidance and support. Ozai's method was to create artificial obstacles and punishments designed to force his son to become stronger through adversity, operating from the assumption that love was a luxury that weakened character and that true growth only occurred under pressure that eliminated alternatives to success or complete failure. This approach had produced a young man who was desperate for approval, but convinced that he was fundamentally inadequate, who interpreted every setback as confirmation of his worthlessness, and every success as temporary respite from inevitable failure. The constant pressure to prove himself worthy of love that was conditional on performance had created a kind of spiritual hunger that no achievement could satisfy, because the underlying message was that he was not acceptable as he was, but only as he might become if he could somehow transform himself into someone more deserving of affection and respect. Iroh's method was based on unconditional love that accepted Zuko exactly as he was, while simultaneously believing in his capacity to grow and change in directions that would bring him greater happiness and effectiveness. This approach required patience that seemed almost superhuman to observers who were accustomed to the immediate results that force and manipulation could achieve, the willingness to continue caring for someone even when that care was rejected, misunderstood, or thrown back in his face by a young man who had been conditioned to see love as weakness and independence as the only path to strength and dignity. The uncle who continued to brew tea for a nephew who insisted he didn't want it, who offered wisdom to someone who claimed he didn't need advice, who expressed affection for a young man who often responded with anger and rejection, was demonstrating a form of masculine strength that their culture had no vocabulary to describe or understand. This was not the aggressive dominance that conquered enemies, or the stoic endurance that withstood hardship without complaint, but the gentle persistence of someone who understood that the most important victories were won through love rather than force, through patience rather than aggression, through the courage to remain vulnerable, even when vulnerability was met with hostility or indifference. The physical strength that Iroh continued to maintain even in his later years, his ability to break free from prison chains or redirect lightning with deadly precision, was never the real source of his power, but simply one expression of the inner strength that came from having made peace with his own limitations and failures. The man who could acknowledge his mistakes without being destroyed by shame, who could admit uncertainty without feeling inadequate, who could ask for help without considering himself weak, had discovered resources that no external circumstance could take away from him. This inner strength was perhaps most clearly demonstrated during his imprisonment in the Fire Nation capital, where he transformed a situation designed to break his spirit into an opportunity for physical and spiritual preparation for whatever challenges lay ahead. The guards who expected to find a broken old man discovered instead someone who had used his time in captivity to become stronger, more focused, and more dangerous than he had ever been as a free man, operating according to his own preferences and convenience. But the strength he developed in prison was not the aggressive power of someone preparing for revenge against those who had wronged him, but the focused energy of someone who understood that his personal suffering was less important than his ability to serve others when the opportunity arose. The body that he built through careful exercise was not meant to intimidate enemies, but to ensure that he would be capable of protecting those he loved when protection was needed, while the spiritual discipline he maintained through meditation and reflection prepared him to act with wisdom rather than emotion when decisive action became necessary. The tears he shed for his son during his imprisonment were not signs of weakness, but expressions of the love that had motivated everything he had become since Lu Ten's death. The recognition that his personal loss had meaning only insofar as it enabled him to understand and respond to the losses that others were experiencing throughout a world torn apart by the very kind of thinking that had once defined his approach to strength and leadership. The grief that had initially seemed like an ending had become a beginning, the foundation for a new way of being that honored both what had been lost and what remained to be protected and nurtured. The gentle revolution that Iroh embodied was particularly threatening to those who benefited from traditional understanding of masculine power because it offered men an alternative to the exhausting competition and emotional isolation that came with trying to maintain dominance through force and intimidation. The possibility that strength could come from vulnerability, that power could grow through service, that respect could be earned through love rather than fear, suggested that much of what their culture had taught them about the nature of manhood was not only wrong but actively harmful to their own well-being and the well-being of those they claimed to care about. The new form of masculinity that Iroh demonstrated was not about rejecting all traditional masculine virtues, but about understanding how those virtues could be expressed through love rather than fear, through service rather than domination, through the patient work of building others up rather than the quick satisfaction of tearing them down. Courage was still necessary, but it was the courage to remain open to pain rather than the courage to inflict it. Strength was still valued, but it was the strength to carry others' burdens rather than the strength to force them to carry yours. This transformation required confronting the deep fear that many men carry about being seen as weak, inadequate, or unworthy of respect. The terror of discovering that without their ability to dominate or intimidate others, they might have nothing valuable to offer the world. Iroh's journey demonstrated that this fear was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what made men valuable and lovable, that the qualities that actually inspired lasting respect and affection were precisely those that traditional masculine culture had taught them to suppress or deny in themselves. The wisdom that came from embracing rather than fighting his own emotional reality had given Iroh access to forms of intelligence and insight that purely rational analysis could never provide, the ability to understand others' motivations and needs through empathy rather than strategic calculation, to respond to conflict with solutions that addressed underlying causes rather than simply overpowering immediate symptoms. This emotional intelligence proved far more effective than traditional masculine problem-solving methods in situations that required healing rather than victory, cooperation rather than domination, patience rather than immediate results. As Zuko gradually learned to embrace the model of strength that his uncle offered, rather than continuing to chase the impossible approval of a father who was incapable of genuine love, the effectiveness of Iroh's approach became increasingly evident to anyone willing to observe the transformation that unconditional acceptance and patient guidance could produce in someone who had been damaged by the traditional masculine culture's approach to child-rearing and character development. The young man who had been desperate and angry became confident and compassionate, not through being forced to change, but through being loved enough to discover his own capacity for growth and positive contribution to the world around him. The revolution in understanding that Iroh represented was not just personal but political, suggesting that societies organized around domination and competition might be less effective and certainly less humane than those organized around cooperation and mutual support. The strength that built communities rather than destroying them, that created security through trust rather than fear, that solved problems through understanding rather than force, pointed toward possibilities for human organization that the Fire Nation's imperial ambitions had never imagined or pursued. But this gentler form of strength was not passive or weak in any conventional sense, as anyone who witnessed Iroh's fierce protection of those he loved could attest. The man who could redirect lightning with perfect precision, who could break through prison walls when necessary, who could face down any opponent with calm confidence, had simply chosen to use his considerable capabilities in service of life rather than death, healing rather than harm, love rather than fear. The choice to be gentle was itself an expression of strength, the security that came from knowing that he was powerful enough to be kind without being taken advantage of, strong enough to be vulnerable without being destroyed, Sometimes life is like this dark tunnel. You can't see the light at the end of the tunnel, but if you just keep moving, you will come to a better place. These words, spoken by Uncle Iroh to a frightened child during one of the darkest periods in the Fire Nation's history, contained within them the essence of everything he had learned about the difference between giving up and letting go, between surrender and acceptance, between the futile attempt to control outcomes and the wisdom of trusting in processes larger than individual will or understanding. The tunnel that Iroh spoke of was not merely metaphorical for someone who had walked through the literal darkness of grief following his son's death, who had spent years wandering in the wilderness of loss without any clear sense of direction or purpose, who had been forced to learn the difference between the kind of hope that depends on specific outcomes and the deeper faith that can persist even when all particular expectations have been shattered by circumstances beyond anyone's ability to predict or prevent. Lu Ten's death had thrust Iroh into the most profound darkness he had ever experienced, a tunnel of pain and confusion that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions without offering even the faintest suggestion of light or exit. The grief that consumed him in those early days was not simply sadness about what he had lost, but a complete disorientation of his understanding of how the world worked, why things happened, and what meaning could be found in a universe that seemed capable of such arbitrary cruelty toward those who least deserved suffering. The father who had sent his son into battle with confidence in Fire Nation's superiority and his own strategic brilliance suddenly found himself confronting the reality that all his power, all his planning, all his accumulated wisdom and experience had been utterly powerless to protect the person who mattered most to him in all the world. The loss revealed not just the fragility of individual life, but the fundamental illusion of control that had sustained him through decades of believing that skill and determination could overcome any obstacle, that proper preparation and superior force could guarantee desired outcomes. The initial response to this shattering recognition was to fight against the reality of what had happened, to search desperately for ways to reverse or undo what seemed unacceptable to every fiber of his being. The general who had never retreated from any military challenge found himself engaged in a battle against death itself, against the finality of loss, against the universe's apparent indifference to human love and hope and desire for different outcomes than those that circumstances had actually produced. This fighting against reality took many forms during the months and years that followed Lu Ten's death, from the obvious attempts to find someone to blame for what had happened to the more subtle efforts to construct narratives that would make the loss meaningful or justify the sacrifices that had led to it. If Lu Ten had died for Fire Nation glory, then perhaps his death had served some larger purpose that could eventually provide comfort to those who mourned his absence. If his sacrifice had contributed to victories that brought honor to his family and nation, then perhaps meaning could be extracted from suffering through connection to causes that transcended individual tragedy. But these attempts to make sense of senseless loss ultimately proved inadequate to the depth of pain that came, not from any failure of understanding, but from the simple reality that someone deeply loved was gone forever, that no amount of meaning or purpose could restore what had been lost or fill the emptiness that his absence had created in the hearts of those who had known and cherished him. The frameworks that had previously provided comfort and direction crumbled under the weight of grief that was too immediate and personal to be transformed into abstract principles or noble causes. The turning point came not through any dramatic revelation or sudden insight, but through the gradual exhaustion that followed months of fighting against what could not be changed, the slow recognition that his efforts to resist or reverse what had happened were consuming energy that might be better devoted to learning how to live with loss, rather than trying to escape from it. The shift from fighting against reality to accepting it was not a single moment of surrender, but a process that unfolded over years, requiring constant choice to embrace what was, rather than continuing to demand what could never be. Learning to let go of his son was perhaps the most difficult thing Iroh had ever attempted, not because it required any particular skill or knowledge, but because it demanded the surrender of the most fundamental human instinct to hold on to what we love, to protect what matters to us, to refuse separation from those whose presence has become essential to our sense of meaning and identity. The process required him to discover the difference between love that clings and love that releases, between caring that becomes attachment and caring that can exist independently of possession or control. The meditation practices that became central to Iroh's daily routine during this period were not attempts to escape from grief or transcend the pain of loss, but methods for learning to be present with whatever emotions arose, without being overwhelmed by their intensity or driven to desperate action by their demands for relief. The sitting in silence that had once seemed like waste of time for someone trained to solve problems through activity and intervention became a way of creating space for feelings to exist without needing to be fixed or changed or made more acceptable to consciousness that preferred comfort to truth. Through these practices, Iroh began to understand that attachment was not the same thing as love, that it was possible to care deeply for someone without needing to control their choices or protect them from all possible harm, that true affection might actually require the courage to let others follow their own paths, even when those paths led to outcomes that those who loved them would never choose for them. This understanding was particularly difficult for someone whose role as father had been defined by responsibility for his child's safety and success, whose identity had been built around the ability to provide guidance and protection that would prevent the very kind of tragedy that had ultimately occurred despite all his efforts. The seasons that cycled through their familiar pattern during Iroh's years of learning to let go provided natural metaphors for the processes of change and renewal that made loss bearable by placing it in the context of larger rhythms that encompassed both death and rebirth, both ending and beginning, both the falling away of what could no longer be sustained and the emergence of new possibilities that grew from the rich soil of what had been composted by time and acceptance. The trees that released their leaves each autumn without mourning or resistance offered lessons about the wisdom of surrendering what had served its purpose in order to make space for whatever might emerge when conditions were right for new growth. But understanding these natural cycles intellectually was very different from learning to embody their wisdom in response to losses that felt too precious and meaningful to be surrendered to any process, no matter how universal or ultimately beneficial. The father's heart that wanted to hold on to his son forever had to learn that true honoring of what had been lost might require releasing the grip of memory that prevented new experiences of love and connection from emerging in the present moment, that clinging to the past could become a barrier to engaging fully with whatever opportunities for joy and service were available right now. The tea ceremony that became Iroh's most characteristic practice during these years was perfectly designed to teach the lessons that letting go required, each cup offering instruction in the art of enjoying something fully while it lasted, without trying to make it permanent or repeatable, exactly as it had been experienced before. The water that was heated could not be returned to its previous temperature. The leaves that were steeped could not be unsteeped. The flavors that developed could not be preserved beyond the time it took to drink what had been prepared with such care and attention. Each cup of tea was therefore a practice in appreciating the present moment without clinging to it, in finding satisfaction in temporary pleasures, without demanding that they last forever, in accepting that the most beautiful experiences were often those that could not be captured or repeated, but only enjoyed fully during the brief time they were available to consciousness. The meditation of tea preparation taught patience with processes that unfolded according to their own timing, while the ritual of sharing taught the joy that came from giving rather than hoarding what was precious. The gradual shift from grief to acceptance that characterized Iroh's journey through loss was not a linear progression from pain to peace, but a spiral process that revisited the same emotional territories again and again from slightly different perspectives, each cycle offering opportunities to relate to familiar feelings with greater wisdom and less resistance than had been possible during previous encounters with the same basic experiences of missing what was gone and wishing for different outcomes than those that reality had actually provided. The waves of sadness that continued to wash over him years after Lu Ten's death were no longer seen as problems to be solved or evidence of failure to heal properly, but as natural expressions of love that persisted beyond physical separation, as reminders of connections that death could interrupt but not destroy, as proof that caring deeply was worth the cost of eventual loss, because the alternative of protecting oneself through emotional numbing would have prevented not just suffering, but also the joy and meaning that made suffering bearable when it inevitably arose. The wisdom that emerged from this long apprenticeship to loss was not theoretical knowledge, but practical skill in navigating the universal human experience of loving what cannot be permanently possessed, of finding meaning in relationships that are bounded by time and circumstance, of building identity and purpose around something more stable than particular outcomes or specific attachments that circumstances might at any moment require releasing. The strength that came from accepting impermanence was paradoxical but undeniable, creating freedom from the anxiety that comes with trying to control what cannot be controlled, while opening possibilities for engagement with life that fear of loss would otherwise prevent. The guidance that Iroh was able to offer others who struggled with their own experiences of loss came not from having transcended grief, but from having learned to carry it without being crushed by its weight, to honor what had been lost without being paralyzed by regret, to continue moving forward through the tunnel of pain, without losing faith that movement itself would eventually lead to better places than those where standing still in familiar suffering would provide. His presence with others who were grieving was particularly powerful because it came from someone who had walked through darkness and emerged, not unscathed, but transformed, not without scars, but with wisdom that could only be gained through direct experience of what they were facing. The image of the tunnel that Iroh used to help others understand their own dark nights of the soul was drawn from his recognition that the most difficult aspect of loss was often the sense of disorientation it created, the feeling of being trapped in circumstances that offered no clear way forward and no possibility of return to previous conditions of happiness and security. The darkness was frightening not just because of its intensity, but because it seemed to offer no guidance about which direction to move or how to distinguish between choices that would lead toward healing and those that would only deepen the pain and confusion. But the metaphor also contained within it the promise that tunnels, by their very nature, were passages rather than destinations, temporary conditions that could be endured and eventually transcended rather than permanent states that would define the rest of life for those who found themselves temporarily lost within their boundaries. The key was not to stop moving when the way forward was unclear, not to demand visible evidence of progress before taking the next step, not to insist on understanding the entire journey before beginning or continuing the patient work of putting one foot in front of the other, with faith that movement itself would eventually reveal the path. The light at the end of the tunnel was not always visible from within the darkness, but it existed nonetheless as the natural result of continuing to move through whatever circumstances had created the sense of being trapped or overwhelmed by conditions that seemed impossible to change or escape. The movement required was not always physical, but often emotional or spiritual. The willingness to continue feeling rather than numbing, to continue loving rather than closing down, to continue engaging with life rather than withdrawing from all possibility of future pain or disappointment. The better place that lay beyond the tunnel was not necessarily better in the sense of being free from all difficulty or loss, but better in the sense of offering perspectives and possibilities that could not be imagined from within the darkness, resources for dealing with future challenges that could only be developed through having survived previous ones, forms of strength and wisdom that were available exclusively to those who had learned to keep moving when movement seemed pointless and the destination remained invisible to ordinary sight. For Iroh, the better place that emerged from his journey through the tunnel of grief was not the restoration of his previous life or the return of what he had lost, but a new way of being that honored both his love for Lu Ten and his continuing responsibilities to the living, particularly to Zuko, whose own journey through darkness would require the kind of guidance that could only be offered by someone who had learned the difference between being lost and being in transition, between being abandoned by hope and being invited to discover forms of faith that did not depend on specific outcomes or guarantees about the future. The stone walls of Fire Nation prisons were designed to break the spirits of those who challenged imperial authority, their cold surfaces and iron bars serving as constant reminders of powerlessness and isolation that were intended to crush hope and leave captives with nothing but regret for their defiance and desperate desire for mercy that would never come from rulers who understood only strength and submission. But in the cell where Uncle Iroh spent the final months before Sozin's comet, something extraordinary was happening that transformed what should have been a place of despair into a sanctuary of preparation and spiritual refinement that demonstrated how consciousness could find light in the darkest circumstances when, guided by wisdom that recognized opportunity where others saw only obstacle. The guards who periodically checked on their famous prisoner expected to find a broken old man, defeated by the reality of his situation and weakened by months of confinement away from the luxuries and comforts that had defined his previous existence as a member of the Fire Nation's royal family. Instead, they discovered someone who seemed to grow stronger and more focused with each passing day, whose physical conditioning improved through disciplined exercise, while his spiritual clarity deepened through meditation practices that transformed his cell from prison into monastery, his captivity from punishment into preparation for whatever service the future might require. The routine that Iroh established within the narrow confines of his imprisonment became a masterclass in finding freedom within constraints, meaning within apparent meaninglessness, purpose within circumstances that seemed designed to eliminate all possibility of meaningful action or contribution to anything beyond personal survival. The dawn exercises that built strength in muscles and flexibility in joints were matched by evening reflections that built resilience in spirit and clarity in understanding, creating a daily rhythm that honored both physical and spiritual needs while maintaining connection to life's essential processes despite artificial separation from the natural world. The sit-ups and push-ups that kept his body prepared for whatever physical challenges might arise were not performed with the grim determination of someone forcing himself through unpleasant necessities, but with the joyful appreciation of someone who understood that each movement was a celebration of life's continuation, each breath an opportunity to maintain the vessel that consciousness required for effective engagement with whatever circumstances might emerge beyond the prison walls. The discipline that others might have seen as tedious routine became for Iroh a form of moving meditation that connected him to the fundamental rhythms of existence while preparing him to serve others when service became possible. But the most remarkable aspect of Iroh's imprisonment was not his physical conditioning or even his spiritual practices, but the way he maintained hope without denying the reality of his situation. The balance between accepting present circumstances completely while remaining open to possibilities that could not be predicted or controlled through individual effort. This was not the desperate optimism of someone who refused to acknowledge how dire his situation had become, but the mature faith of someone who had learned to trust in processes larger than personal preference or immediate appearance, who understood that darkness was often the prelude to dawn, rather than evidence that light would never return. The hope that sustained Iroh during his months of captivity was not hope for any specific outcome or rescue scenario, but hope in the fundamental tendency of life toward growth, healing, and the eventual triumph of love over fear, wisdom over ignorance, compassion over cruelty. This deeper form of hope did not depend on evidence that things were getting better or guarantees that suffering would end according to any particular timeline, but on recognition that consciousness itself was a miracle that could find meaning and beauty in any circumstances, that the capacity for love and understanding could not be destroyed by external conditions, no matter how challenging or apparently hopeless they might appear. The stories that Iroh told himself during the long hours of solitude were not fantasies of escape or revenge against those who had imprisoned him, but memories of moments when he had witnessed the human capacity for transformation. Times when people had chosen love over hatred, forgiveness over vengeance, service over self-interest in circumstances that would have justified very different choices. These memories served as evidence that the darkness currently surrounding him was temporary rather than permanent, part of larger patterns that included both suffering and healing, both separation and reunion, both endings and beginnings that often came disguised as each other until time revealed their true nature. The meditation on impermanence that had begun during his grief for Lu Ten continued and deepened during his imprisonment, but now it encompassed not just loss and letting go, but also the recognition that difficult circumstances were as temporary as pleasant ones, that prison walls were as impermanent as palace gardens, that separation from loved ones was as subject to change as the seasons that continued their ancient cycles beyond the stone barriers that blocked his view of sky and earth. This understanding created a kind of patience that was not passive resignation, but active preparation, readiness to respond appropriately to whatever opportunities might emerge when conditions shifted in ways that no one could predict or control. The letters that Iroh never sent but composed in his mind during those months created imaginary conversations with everyone he loved, particularly with Zuko, whose own journey through darkness was unfolding simultaneously in places and ways that his uncle could only hope and trust were leading toward wisdom rather than destruction. These mental communications served multiple purposes: maintaining emotional connection across physical separation, practicing the kind of guidance he hoped to offer when reunion became possible, and working through his own understanding of lessons that prison was teaching him about resilience, acceptance, and the inexhaustible creativity of consciousness in finding meaning and purpose regardless of external limitations. The advice that he would have given Zuko during this period focused not on specific strategies for dealing with particular challenges, but on the fundamental attitudes and approaches that made it possible to navigate uncertainty without being overwhelmed by anxiety, to face opposition without being consumed by anger, to continue loving, even when love seemed to bring only pain and disappointment. The wisdom that prison was teaching Iroh about finding light in darkness was exactly what he knew his nephew would need during his own struggles with identity, purpose, and the choice between different models of strength and success. The physical transformation that occurred during Iroh's imprisonment was remarkable enough to surprise the guards who had grown accustomed to monitoring his activities, but the spiritual transformation was even more profound, though less visible to casual observation. The man who emerged from those months of forced solitude was not the same person who had been captured, not because imprisonment had broken him, but because it had provided the time and space necessary for completing a process of spiritual refinement that had been years in the making, but had never before had the benefit of such complete freedom from external distractions and obligations. The silence that filled his days was not empty but pregnant with possibility, charged with the kind of potential that could only develop in spaces protected from the constant demands and interruptions that usually prevented deep reflection and fundamental reorientation of consciousness toward its most essential priorities and purposes. The absence of conversation with others created space for more intimate communication with the deepest aspects of his own nature, while the lack of external stimulation allowed subtle inner voices to emerge that were normally drowned out by the noise of daily activity and social interaction. The tears that Iroh shed during his imprisonment were not tears of self-pity or despair, but expressions of love that had nowhere else to go, manifestations of care and concern for people he could not reach or help through normal means, but continued to hold in his heart with the intensity that physical separation could not diminish. These tears were prayers made liquid, hopes made visible, love made manifest in the only form available to someone whose capacity for caring had not been reduced by confinement, but only redirected toward forms of service that required no physical presence or material resources. The gratitude that grew within him during these months was perhaps the most surprising aspect of his experience, arising not from comparison with worst possible circumstances, but from recognition of how much meaning and purpose could be discovered, even in situations that seemed to offer nothing but limitation and frustration. The grateful heart that found reasons for appreciation in the simplest aspects of continued existence, the rhythm of breathing, the circulation of blood, the operation of consciousness itself, transformed prison from place of punishment into monastery, where the most essential lessons about life's nature and meaning could be learned without interference from external complications. The preparation that occupied both his body and spirit during this period was not preparation for any specific scenario or challenge, but preparation for whatever service life might require, whatever opportunities for love and wisdom might emerge, whatever responsibilities might be placed upon shoulders that prison had made stronger rather than weaker. Through months of dedicated conditioning and spiritual discipline, the readiness that developed was complete openness to whatever might come, combined with confidence that resources would be available to meet whatever demands circumstances might make upon his capacity for appropriate response. The breaking free that eventually came was not just physical liberation from stone walls and iron bars, but the culmination of months of inner work that had prepared consciousness for engagement with a world that had continued changing during his absence, that would require different kinds of wisdom and strength than those he had possessed when first confined. The man who walked out of that prison was someone who had learned to find light in the darkest possible circumstances, who had discovered that hope was not dependent on external conditions, but arose from sources within consciousness, that no power on earth could touch or diminish or destroy. The reunion with sunlight, after months of artificial illumination, was symbolic of reunion with possibilities that had seemed lost forever, with connections that physical separation could interrupt but not sever, with purposes that confinement could delay but not eliminate. The freedom that meant most was not freedom from walls and bars, but freedom to serve again, to love again, to offer whatever wisdom had been gained through suffering to those who might benefit from guidance that could only be provided by someone who had learned to maintain hope when hope seemed impossible, to find meaning when meaning seemed absent, to discover light when darkness seemed complete and permanent. The strength that Iroh brought to his reunion with Zuko and his participation in the final battles of the war was not just the physical power that months of disciplined exercise had built into previously aging muscles, but the spiritual resilience that came from having proved to himself that consciousness could find resources for any challenge, meaning in any circumstance, hope in any darkness when properly oriented toward life's fundamental tendencies rather than trapped by immediate appearances or temporary setbacks. The light that he had found in the deepest darkness became a beacon for others who were struggling with their own forms of imprisonment, physical, emotional, spiritual, or psychological circumstances that seemed to offer no way forward, no possibility of change, no reason for hope or continued effort. The example of someone who had emerged from apparent defeat, stronger and wiser rather than broken and bitter, provided evidence that the human spirit possessed resources that ordinary consciousness rarely accessed, but extreme circumstances could reveal and develop into practical capabilities for meeting whatever challenges life might present. The wisdom that flowed from this experience was not abstract philosophy, but practical knowledge about how consciousness could find freedom within any constraints, meaning within any apparent meaninglessness, hope within any darkness when properly understood and skillfully applied to whatever circumstances arose. The teacher who had learned these lessons through direct experience rather than theoretical study could offer guidance that carried the authority of tested wisdom, the credibility that came from having walked through fire and emerged not unburned but transformed, not undamaged but strengthened in ways that damage alone could never accomplish. The revolution in understanding that prison had completed for Iroh was the recognition that external circumstances had no power to determine the essential quality of inner experience, that consciousness possessed resources for creating meaning and finding purpose, regardless of limitations imposed by situations beyond individual control. This understanding created a kind of invulnerability that was not indifference to suffering, but transcendence of the belief that suffering eliminated possibilities for joy, growth, service, and love. The light he found in darkness illuminated possibilities that darkness itself had made visible, opportunities that could only be recognized by those who had learned to see with eyes that were not dependent on external illumination for their vision. The transformation that brought Uncle Iroh from Fire Nation General to wise teacher was not a single moment of dramatic conversion, but a gradual awakening that unfolded across years of confronting the gap between who he had been and who he was capable of becoming, between the values he had inherited from his culture and the deeper truths that emerged from wrestling with loss, failure, and the slow recognition that everyone, including himself, deserved opportunities for growth and change that went beyond simple categories of good and evil, worthy and unworthy, redeemable and irredeemably lost. The man who sat in Ba Sing Se's tea shop during the quiet months before Sozin's comet was someone who had learned forgiveness, not as abstract moral principle, but as practical necessity for anyone who hoped to move beyond the paralyzing weight of shame and regret that came from honest acknowledgement of how much damage thoughtless actions could cause, how many people could be hurt by decisions made from positions of power by those who had never bothered to consider the full consequences of policies implemented in service of causes that seemed obviously righteous from perspectives that had never been challenged by direct encounter with their human cost. The general who had once led armies against Ba Sing Se, with complete confidence in the justice of Fire Nation expansion, had been forced by his son's death to confront the reality that Lu Ten's sacrifice was not unique, that countless other families throughout the Earth Kingdom, water tribes, and what remained of the air nomads had experienced identical losses caused by military strategies that Iroh himself had designed and implemented with the same casual efficiency that he now brought to brewing tea and serving customers who had no idea that their gentle server had once been responsible for years of suffering that rippled through generations of people whose only crime had been living in places that the Fire Nation wanted to control. The weight of this recognition could have crushed him entirely, could have led to the kind of despair that makes continued living impossible for those who discover too late how much pain they have caused, through actions that seemed not just justified, but necessary at the time they were taken. But the path toward healing that Iroh discovered required him to understand that drowning in guilt served no one, that self-destruction disguised as moral accountability was just another form of selfishness that prevented him from dedicating whatever time remained in his life to making amends through service that honored both those he had harmed and those who still needed whatever wisdom he had gained through his journey from ignorance to understanding. The first step in this process was learning to forgive himself, not by minimizing the harm he had caused or finding excuses that would make his past actions seem acceptable, but by accepting full responsibility for what he had done, while refusing to let shame prevent him from using his remaining years in ways that served life rather than death, healing rather than harm, love rather than the fear that had motivated so much of his previous behavior. This self-forgiveness was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his transformation because it required holding two apparently contradictory truths simultaneously: that his actions had caused terrible suffering that could never be undone, and that his continued existence could still contribute something valuable to a world that he had helped to damage. The forgiveness he offered Zuko was even more complex, because it involved loving someone who was actively rejecting that love, supporting someone who was working against everything Iroh now understood to be true and important, maintaining patience with someone whose choices were causing fresh pain, not just to himself, but to innocent people, caught in the path of his desperate attempts to win approval from a father who was incapable of genuine love or respect for anyone, including his own children. The uncle who continued to care for his nephew despite betrayal, rejection, and open hostility was demonstrating a form of love that transcended normal categories of relationship and expectation. The challenge of loving Zuko without enabling his destructive behavior required Iroh to develop forms of wisdom that went far beyond conventional understanding of how care should be expressed between family members, how support should be offered to those who seemed determined to make choices that would ultimately destroy their own chances for happiness and fulfillment. The balance between acceptance and accountability, between compassion and consequences, between infinite patience and appropriate boundaries, demanded constant attention to the difference between helping someone grow and helping them avoid the natural results of their actions. The betrayal at Ba Sing Se, when Zuko chose to side with Azula despite everything Iroh had tried to teach him about love, honor, and the importance of making choices based on what was right rather than what was expedient, represented the ultimate test of unconditional love, and the question of whether caring for someone could survive the complete rejection of everything that relationship represented. The pain that Iroh experienced in that crystal cavern was not just personal disappointment, but the agony of watching someone he loved choose a path that could only lead to greater suffering for everyone involved, including Zuko himself. But even this betrayal, devastating as it was to someone who had invested years of patient teaching and unconditional support in his nephew's development, became another opportunity for Iroh to demonstrate the difference between love that depends on reciprocation and love that flows from sources deeper than personal need or expectation. The forgiveness he offered Zuko was not immediate or easy, but it was complete once he had processed his own pain and recognized that his nephew's choices had been made from confusion and desperation rather than malice, from the twisted psychology that Ozai's abuse had created, rather than from fundamental character flaws that made him unworthy of continued love and support. The months in prison that followed gave Iroh time to reflect on the relationship between forgiveness and enabling, between loving someone and taking responsibility for their choices, between offering support and maintaining the kind of boundaries that actually served growth, rather than perpetuating patterns that prevented maturity from developing. The wisdom he gained during this period of forced separation would prove essential when reunion with Zuko became possible, providing him with understanding of how love could be both unconditional and appropriately demanding, both patient and clear about expectations. The transformation that Zuko underwent during his time with the Avatar and his friends demonstrated that Iroh's faith in his nephew's capacity for change had been justified, that the years of patient teaching and unconditional love had planted seeds that eventually grew into the wisdom and compassion that enabled the young prince to reject everything his father represented in favor of values that honored life, rather than destroying it. But this transformation was not the result of Iroh's efforts alone. It required Zuko's own willingness to face the pain of recognizing how wrong he had been, to accept responsibility for harm he had caused, to choose difficult growth over comfortable self-deception. The reunion between uncle and nephew in the White Lotus camp was perhaps the most moving moment in their entire relationship, because it demonstrated how forgiveness could create space for genuine healing, rather than simply covering over wounds that had never been properly addressed. The young man who approached his uncle with such humility and genuine remorse was not the same person who had betrayed him in Ba Sing Se, just as the old man who welcomed him with such joy and acceptance was not quite the same person who had been hurt so deeply by that betrayal. The forgiveness that flowed between them in that moment was mutual and complete, encompassing not just the specific incidents that had caused pain, but the entire pattern of misunderstanding and crossed purposes that had characterized their relationship during Zuko's years of confusion about identity, loyalty, and the nature of true honor. The embrace they shared contained within it all the love that had been offered, rejected, maintained through separation, and finally accepted when both were ready to receive what the other had been trying to give all along. The teaching that Iroh had provided about firebending techniques and combat strategies was ultimately less important than the teaching he had offered about forgiveness, both the necessity of forgiving others and the equal necessity of learning to forgive oneself for mistakes that could not be undone, but could be transformed into wisdom that prevented similar mistakes in the future. The nephew, who had finally learned these lessons, was ready not just to face his father in final confrontation, but to rule the Fire Nation from a foundation of compassion rather than fear, understanding rather than domination. The example that their reconciliation provided for others who struggled with family relationships damaged by years of misunderstanding, conflict, and hurt feelings was particularly powerful because it demonstrated that even the deepest wounds could heal when approached with patience, wisdom, and genuine commitment to growth rather than victory. The uncle, who had waited years for his nephew to mature enough to recognize the value of what he had been offering, was rewarded not just with personal happiness, but with the knowledge that his example of unconditional love had contributed to creating a leader who could help heal the damage that previous Fire Nation rulers had inflicted on the world. But Iroh's understanding of redemption extended beyond his personal relationship with Zuko to encompass his recognition that entire cultures and institutions could change when enough individuals within them chose growth over stagnation. love over fear, service over self-interest. The Fire Nation itself was not irredeemably evil despite the terrible things it had done during a century of war, but was capable of transformation when led by people who understood that true strength came from helping others rather than dominating them, that real security came from being loved rather than feared. The patience that redemption required was perhaps its most challenging aspect, the recognition that genuine change could not be rushed or forced but had to unfold according to its own timing. That external pressure to reform quickly often produced surface compliance rather than deep transformation. That lasting change required internal motivation rather than external compulsion. The gardener who understood these principles could plant seeds and provide proper conditions for growth, but could not make plants grow faster than their nature allowed or in directions that violated their essential characteristics. The hope that sustained Iroh through years of watching Zuko struggle with choices between competing values and loyalties was not hope for any specific outcome, but hope in the fundamental human capacity for growth and positive change, faith that love and wisdom would eventually prove more attractive than fear and ignorance when people were given genuine alternatives and sufficient time to recognize the difference between approaches that served life and those that served death. This hope was not naive optimism, but mature faith, based on his own experience of transformation and his observation of others who had chosen difficult growth over comfortable stagnation. The revolution in understanding that Iroh represented was not just personal, but political and spiritual, suggesting that societies built on domination and exploitation could evolve into communities organized around cooperation and mutual support, that individuals shaped by trauma and abuse could learn to create relationships based on love and respect, that patterns of behavior that seemed fixed and unchangeable could be transformed when enough people committed to the patient work of healing rather than revenge, growth rather than punishment, understanding rather than judgment. The legacy that Iroh left through his example of redemption and forgiveness extended far beyond his influence on Zuko, to encompass everyone who witnessed their relationship and learned from it about possibilities for healing that they had never imagined could exist in their own lives, their own families, their own communities. The uncle who had learned to love without conditions or guarantees, to forgive without requiring assurance that forgiveness would be appreciated or reciprocated, to maintain hope when hope seemed foolish or dangerous, provided a model of how wisdom and compassion could transform even the most damaged relationships into sources of strength and joy. The tea that he shared with former enemies in Ba Sing Se after the war's end was more than simple hospitality, but a sacrament of reconciliation that demonstrated how people who had once sought to destroy each other could learn to find common ground in their shared humanity, their mutual need for love and understanding, their common desire for peace and security that could only be achieved through cooperation rather than conquest. The man who served tea to Earth Kingdom citizens whose lives he had once threatened embodied the possibility that anyone could change, that no one was beyond redemption, that even the darkest past could be transformed into foundation for a brighter future when approached with sufficient wisdom, patience, and love. Love is brightest in the dark. These words, spoken by Uncle Iroh during one of his conversations with Zuko about the nature of caring and commitment, contained within them everything he had learned about the transformative power of affection that persists regardless of circumstances, that grows stronger under pressure rather than weaker, that finds its truest expression not in moments of ease and mutual satisfaction, but in the crucible of difficulty, where love's authenticity is tested against every possible reason to give up, withdraw, or protect oneself from further disappointment and pain. The love that Iroh offered his nephew was unlike anything Zuko had previously experienced in relationships that had taught him to understand affection as something that must be earned through achievement, maintained through good behavior, and lost through failure or disappointment of those whose approval seemed essential for any sense of worth or belonging in the world. The Fire Nation's royal family had operated according to principles that made love conditional on performance, respect dependent on power, and acceptance contingent on conformity to expectations that seemed designed more to maintain hierarchy than to nurture the growth and well-being of individual family members. But the uncle who continued to care for his nephew despite betrayal, rejection, and active hostility was demonstrating a radically different understanding of what it meant to love another person, an approach that transcended normal categories of relationship and expectation to touch something deeper and more enduring than the temporary emotions and changing circumstances that usually determined how people treated each other. This was not the sentimental affection that flourished during good times and evaporated when tested by conflict or disappointment, but the mature love that recognized the essential worth of another consciousness, regardless of their current behavior or apparent appreciation for what was being offered. The foundation for this unconditional love had been laid during Iroh's own journey through grief and loss. His recognition that Lu Ten's death had taught him about the preciousness of every moment spent with those who mattered, the irreplaceable value of connections that could be interrupted by circumstances, but never truly severed by anything as temporary as physical separation, or even death itself. The father who had learned too late how much his son meant to him was determined not to make the same mistake with his nephew, not to wait for perfect conditions or guaranteed reciprocation before expressing the care that flowed naturally from his heart whenever he considered Zuko's struggles and potential. The patience that this love required was perhaps its most remarkable quality, the willingness to continue offering guidance and support to someone who seemed determined to reject everything that was being given with such generosity and consistency. The months and years of watching Zuko make choices that brought pain to himself and others, of witnessing his nephew's desperate attempts to win approval from someone incapable of genuine love, of maintaining hope for transformation that seemed increasingly unlikely, as setbacks accumulated and opportunities for growth were repeatedly squandered, would have tested the endurance of anyone whose caring was based on expectation of return or evidence of progress. But Iroh's love for Zuko was not dependent on his nephew's ability to receive it gracefully or use it wisely, just as the sun's light was not diminished by the failure of plants to grow in soil too damaged to support healthy development, just as the ocean's depth was not reduced by the inability of containers to hold all the water that was available for those with capacity to receive it. This understanding freed him from the frustration and resentment that usually accompanied one-sided relationships, allowing him to find satisfaction in the act of loving itself, rather than in any particular outcome that such love might produce. The teaching that flowed from this foundation was necessarily indirect, because direct instruction would have triggered Zuko's defensive mechanisms, his learned responses to authority and guidance that had been shaped by years of experiencing wisdom as weapon, wielded by those who used superior knowledge to control and manipulate rather than empower and liberate. The uncle who understood this dynamic had to find ways of sharing what he knew, without creating the impression that he was trying to impose his will or demonstrate his superiority, methods of guidance that preserved his nephew's sense of autonomy, while providing access to insights that could be accepted or rejected according to readiness rather than obligation. The stories that Iroh told during their travels together were carefully chosen to illustrate principles without preaching them, to demonstrate possibilities without demanding specific choices, to plant seeds of wisdom that could germinate when conditions were right, rather than forcing immediate acceptance of ideas that Zuko might not be prepared to integrate into his understanding of himself and his situation. The parable about the prince who disguised himself as a beggar the tale of the general who learned humility through defeat, the legend of the dragon who chose cooperation over conquest. Each narrative contained lessons that could be received at whatever level of depth the listener was capable of accessing. The tea ceremony that became such a central part of their daily routine together was perhaps the most subtle and effective form of teaching that Iroh employed, because it created shared experiences of beauty, patience, and mindfulness, without requiring any explicit commitment to values or principles that might have triggered Zuko's resistance to instruction. The simple act of preparing and sharing tea together taught lessons about timing, attention, respect for process, appreciation of simple pleasures, and the importance of being present to whatever was happening in the current moment, rather than constantly striving toward future goals or dwelling on past failures. These tea ceremonies also provided opportunities for the kind of comfortable silence that allowed deeper communication to occur through presence rather than words, through the quality of attention they brought to shared activities rather than through explicit discussion of thoughts and feelings that might have felt too vulnerable to express directly. The nephew, who gradually learned to find peace in these quiet moments, was unconsciously absorbing lessons about the value of stillness, the wisdom of slowing down, the satisfaction that could be found in simple appreciation of immediate experience, rather than constant pursuit of external validation or achievement. The protection that Iroh's love provided was not the aggressive defense that might have shielded Zuko from all consequences of his choices, but the steady presence that ensured he would never be completely alone, regardless of how far he wandered from wisdom or how thoroughly he seemed to reject the guidance that was available to him. This protection was like a safety net that remained in place, even when the person it was meant to catch insisted they didn't need it, and actively worked to avoid falling into circumstances where its value would become apparent. The sacrifice that such love required was not dramatic or visible to casual observers, but was nevertheless real and demanding, requiring Iroh to set aside his own preferences, comfort, and safety in service of someone who often seemed ungrateful for what was being offered and determined to make choices that created additional difficulty for both of them. The uncle who followed his nephew into exile, who shared the hardships of life as refugees, who endured rejection and hostility while continuing to provide care and guidance, was demonstrating love through action, rather than merely expressing it through words or sentiment. The transformation in Iroh's understanding of love had begun with Lu Ten's death, but continued throughout his relationship with Zuko, each challenge and setback providing opportunities to discover new dimensions of caring that he had never previously imagined or needed to develop. The general, who had once thought he understood love because he felt protective toward his son, learned through loss and subsequent relationship with his nephew that genuine affection was far more complex and demanding than he had ever realized, requiring forms of wisdom and patience that could only be cultivated through direct experience of loving someone whose responses could not be controlled or predicted. The grief that had initially seemed like pure loss gradually revealed itself as education in love's true nature, teaching him that caring for others was not primarily about receiving appreciation or seeing immediate results from efforts to help, but about maintaining space for another person's growth and happiness, regardless of how long such development might take or what forms it might assume when it finally occurred. The father who had lost his biological son discovered through his relationship with his nephew that love was not diminished by loss, but refined by it, not weakened by difficulty, but strengthened through being tested against every possible reason to give up or withdraw. The example that this love provided for Zuko was perhaps more powerful than any direct teaching could have been, because it demonstrated through consistent action, over years of shared experience, what unconditional acceptance looked like when embodied by someone whose words and behavior remained aligned, regardless of external pressures or internal frustrations. The young man who had never received such love from his biological father gradually learned to recognize its value through exposure to its authentic expression, though the process of accepting what was being offered required overcoming years of conditioning that had taught him to distrust affection and expect disappointment from anyone who claimed to care about his well-being. The breakthrough that eventually allowed Zuko to receive his uncle's love came not through any change in what Iroh was offering, but through his nephew's growing recognition that his desperate pursuit of his father's approval was futile and destructive, that the conditional acceptance he had been seeking would never provide the satisfaction and security he needed, that genuine love was available from someone who had been offering it consistently, even when it was rejected or taken for granted. This recognition required courage, because accepting love meant becoming vulnerable to loss, admitting need, and acknowledging that he had been wrong about fundamental assumptions that had guided his behavior for years. The reunion between uncle and nephew in the White Lotus camp was the culmination of years of patient love finally being received by someone who had developed sufficient wisdom and humility to recognize its value and respond appropriately to what was being offered. The embrace they shared contained within it all the care that had been given, rejected, maintained through separation, and finally accepted when both parties were ready to participate fully in the relationship that had been waiting for them throughout all the years of misunderstanding and missed connections. The forgiveness that flowed between them was not just about specific incidents of betrayal or disappointment, but about the entire pattern of love offered and refused, guidance provided and ignored, patience extended and tested beyond what seemed reasonable or sustainable. The uncle, who welcomed his nephew without recrimination or demands for explanation, was demonstrating love's capacity to transcend hurt feelings and wounded pride in service of connections that were more important than any particular sequence of events that might have temporarily damaged their relationship. The wisdom that their reconciliation revealed was that genuine love was not dependent on perfect communication or mutual understanding, but could persist through years of confusion and conflict when its foundation was solid enough to withstand whatever storms might arise. The relationship that had seemed hopelessly damaged by betrayal and rejection proved to be more resilient than either party had imagined, capable of not just surviving but emerging stronger from trials that would have destroyed connections based on less substantial foundations than the unconditional care that had sustained Iroh's commitment to his nephew's well-being throughout all their difficulties. The teaching about love that emerged from their experience together was not theoretical but practical, demonstrating through lived example that caring for others was simultaneously the most challenging and the most rewarding aspect of human existence, requiring everything that consciousness could offer while providing meaning and satisfaction that no other activity could match. The uncle, who had learned to love without guarantee of reciprocation, had discovered resources within himself that he had never known existed, capacities for patience, forgiveness, and hope that had been developed through the practice of loving someone who needed such gifts, even when they could not acknowledge or appreciate what was being provided. The ripple effects of this love extended far beyond the relationship between uncle and nephew to influence everyone who witnessed their interaction and learned from it about possibilities for caring that they had never imagined could exist in their own lives and relationships. The example of someone who maintained unconditional love despite years of rejection and betrayal provided evidence that such love was possible for anyone willing to make the commitment and do the inner work that its expression required, that the human heart was capable of far more generosity and resilience than most people ever discovered or developed. The legacy that this love created was not just personal but cultural and political, suggesting that societies could be organized around principles of mutual care and support rather than competition and exploitation, that institutions could be designed to nurture growth rather than maintain control, that leadership could be based on service rather than domination when enough people understood the difference between power that empowers others and power that diminishes them. The uncle whose love had transformed a confused and angry young man into a wise and compassionate leader had demonstrated that caring itself was a force for positive change in the world, that love properly understood and skillfully applied could address problems that violence and coercion could never solve effectively or permanently. The wisdom that Uncle Iroh had gained through decades of experience with fire, loss, and the patient observation of how life moved through its endless cycles of growth and decay had taught him that balance was not a destination to be reached but a dance to be danced, not a problem to be solved once and forgotten, but a practice that required constant attention to the interplay of forces that shaped every moment of existence, from the movement of breath through lungs to the rotation of seasons through their ancient patterns of renewal and rest. It is important to draw wisdom from many different places. These words, spoken to Zuko during one of their conversations about firebending and its relationship to the other elements, contained within them Iroh's revolutionary understanding that strength came not from purity or specialization, but from integration, not from perfecting a single approach to life's challenges, but from learning to appreciate and incorporate insights that emerge from traditions, perspectives, and ways of being that might initially seem foreign or even contradictory to everything one had been taught to value and pursue. The firebending that Iroh taught was unlike anything that the Fire Nation's military academies had developed during their century of conquest and expansion, because it drew inspiration not just from the aggressive techniques that had made their armies so effective in battle, but from the flowing movements of waterbending, the solid stability of earthbending, and the light flexibility of airbending that together created possibilities for expression and application that no single elemental tradition could provide when isolated from the wisdom that other approaches to bending had discovered through their own centuries of experimentation and raffinement. The lightning redirection technique that became one of Iroh's most famous innovations was the perfect example of how balance between opposing forces could create something entirely new and more powerful than anything that pure dedication to a single element could achieve. The ability to receive electrical energy safely and redirect it toward chosen targets required understanding water's capacity to flow and adapt, Earth's ability to ground and stabilize, air's tendency to find the path of least resistance, all integrated with fire's natural intensity and directional focus in ways that honored each element's essential nature, while transcending the limitations that came from working within any single tradition. But the technique was dangerous precisely because it required the practitioner to maintain perfect balance between forces that could easily destroy anyone who lacked the wisdom to understand their proper relationship to each other and the patience to develop the kind of inner stability that made such balance sustainable under the pressure of actual combat or crisis situations. The slightest imbalance, the smallest moment of losing center, could result in the lightning consuming the person who attempted to redirect it rather than flowing harmlessly through them toward whatever target they had chosen for its expression. This physical technique served as metaphor for the larger spiritual and psychological balance that Iroh had learned was necessary for anyone who hoped to navigate life's complexities without being overwhelmed by forces too powerful for any individual consciousness to control through will alone. The person who could redirect lightning was someone who had learned to work with reality as it actually was, rather than insisting that it conformed to personal preferences or cultural expectations. someone who had developed the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining the stability that prevented adaptation from becoming mere reactivity without purpose or direction. The tea blending that occupied so much of Iroh's attention during his years as refugee and exile was another expression of this same principle applied to much gentler materials and circumstances. The understanding that the most satisfying flavors emerged not from single ingredients pursued to their ultimate expression, but from combinations that created harmony between elements that might seem incompatible until their essential natures were properly understood and their proportions carefully calibrated to bring out the best qualities of each component while creating something entirely new that transcended what any individual ingredient could provide alone. The jasmine tea that became Iroh's signature creation was not simply jasmine or simply green tea, but the marriage of floral delicacy with earthier foundation that neither element could achieve in isolation, requiring patience to discover the proper proportions and timing that would allow each component to contribute its essential gifts without overwhelming the other or creating muddy confusion that served neither ingredient's highest potential. The brewing process itself taught lessons about balance between heat and time, between strength and subtlety, between desire for immediate results and willingness to wait for natural processes to unfold according to their own internal wisdom. The seasons that Iroh observed with such careful attention during his travels with Zuko provided natural examples of how balance operated on scales far larger than individual human life, demonstrating how periods of growth and activity alternated with times of rest and apparent dormancy, in patterns that served the health of entire ecosystems while ensuring that no single tendency, whether toward expansion or contraction, heat or cold, light or darkness, dominated permanently in ways that would eventually destroy the very conditions that made life possible and sustainable over long periods of time. The autumn that scattered leaves across their path during one of their journeys became occasion for reflection on how beauty could emerge from letting go, how the trees' willingness to release what they could no longer sustain created the conditions for winter's rest and spring's eventual renewal, how apparent loss was often preparation for transformation that could not occur while consciousness remained attached to forms that no longer served their original purposes. The bare branches that seemed dead to casual observation were actually conserving energy for new growth that would emerge when conditions were right for expansion rather than conservation. The winter that tested their resourcefulness and endurance was not just obstacle to be overcome, but teacher of lessons about finding warmth and sustenance when external conditions offered little support for comfort or easy living, about discovering inner resources that could sustain life, and even joy when circumstances seemed designed to eliminate both. The snow that made travel difficult also created beauty that was available only to those present during this particular season, while the cold that demanded careful attention to fire and shelter also simplified life by eliminating distractions and focusing attention on what was truly essential for survival and well-being. The spring that eventually followed demonstrated how periods of apparent dormancy were actually times of invisible preparation for explosion of new life that would have been impossible without winter's period of rest and conservation, how the balance between activity and stillness served purposes that could not be achieved through constant growth or permanent rest, but only through rhythmic alternation that honored both tendencies while being dominated by neither. The flowers that emerged from seemingly dead ground were proof that life's apparent endings were often actually beginnings disguised by limitations of perspective that could not perceive the larger patterns within which individual events gained their true meaning. The summer that brought both abundance and challenge taught lessons about how blessing and difficulty often arrived together, how periods of plenty required wisdom to avoid excess that would create problems during leaner times, how the same sun that nourished growth could also create drought if not balanced by sufficient water, shade, and rest from its intensity. The fruit that ripened during these months was available only to those who had planted seeds and tended growth during previous seasons, demonstrating how present enjoyment was connected to past preparations in ways that made gratitude and forward thinking equally important for sustainable well-being. The balance between solitude and community that characterized Iroh's approach to living required constant attention to the difference between isolation that served reflection and restoration and withdrawal that prevented necessary engagement with others who needed what wisdom and service he could provide. The hermit who spent all his time alone might develop deep insights but would fail to share them with those who could benefit from such knowledge, while the person who never took time for solitude might remain so busy responding to external demands that he never developed the inner clarity that made his responses truly helpful, rather than merely busy activity that created appearance of helpfulness without its substance. The meditation practices that Iroh maintained throughout his various life circumstances were designed to cultivate the kind of inner balance that made appropriate response to external situations possible rather than simply reactive behavior that repeated unconscious patterns without regard for what particular circumstances actually required. The mind that could remain calm during crisis while staying alert to real dangers, that could be compassionate without being naive about human capacity for both good and evil, that could maintain hope without denying difficult realities, was mind that had learned to dance with contradictions rather than being paralyzed by them. The relationship between strength and flexibility that Iroh embodied demonstrated how apparent opposites could work together to create capabilities that neither quality could provide alone. How the person who was strong enough to stand firm when necessary, but flexible enough to bend without breaking when resistance would serve no useful purpose, had access to responses that pure stubbornness or complete compliance could never match. The bamboo that bent before strong winds while maintaining its roots was more likely to survive storms than the oak that insisted on rigid resistance until forces became strong enough to uproot it entirely. The balance between confidence and humility that made Iroh such an effective teacher required understanding that genuine knowledge created awareness of how much remained unknown rather than pride in what had been mastered. That wisdom demonstrated itself through willingness to learn from anyone and any situation rather than through displays of superior understanding that prevented continued growth. The teacher who remained student could offer guidance without creating dependency, could share knowledge without claiming authority, could inspire growth without controlling direction. The political implications of Iroh's approach to balance were revolutionary because they suggested that nations could be strong without being aggressive, secure without being fearful of their neighbors, proud of their achievements without needing to diminish others' accomplishments, confident in their values without insisting that everyone else adopt identical approaches to questions that might have multiple valid answers depending on circumstances and cultural context. The fire nation that could appreciate earthbending's stability, waterbending's adaptability, and airbending's freedom would be more powerful, and certainly more peaceful than one that insisted on the superiority of fire alone. The leadership style that emerged from this understanding emphasized service rather than domination, coordination rather than control, inspiration rather than intimidation as methods for motivating others to contribute their best efforts toward shared goals that served everyone's genuine interests, rather than merely benefiting those who happened to hold positions of public authority. The leader who understood balance could draw on diverse perspectives and capabilities while maintaining unity of purpose. could make difficult decisions without alienating those who might have preferred different choices, could maintain stability while remaining open to change when circumstances required adaptation. The inner balance that made such leadership possible was not natural gift but cultivated skill that required constant practice and attention, regular examination of motivations and methods to ensure that power was being used wisely rather than simply effectively, that success was being measured by its contribution to overall well-being rather than merely by its ability to achieve stated objectives regardless of costs or side effects that might create future problems, even while solving immediate challenges. The legacy of Iroh's approach to balance was visible not just in his own transformation from aggressive general to wise teacher, but in the influence he had on everyone who learned from his example about possibilities for integrating opposing forces rather than choosing sides in conflicts that might be resolved through synthesis rather than victory, cooperation rather than competition, understanding rather than judgment of differences that could be sources of strength rather than causes for division and hostility. The fragrance of jasmine tea that drifted through the air wherever Uncle Iroh chose to pause and prepare his afternoon refreshment was more than pleasant aroma or simple beverage, but the visible expression of an entire philosophy of living that found profound meaning in the humblest activities, that transformed routine necessity into sacred ritual, that discovered infinite richness within moments that others might dismiss as insignificant interruptions in the pursuit of more obviously important goals and achievements that seemed to promise greater satisfaction than anything so ordinary as boiling water and steeping leaves could possibly provide. The tea ceremony that had become such a central part of Iroh's daily practice was not inherited tradition from his royal upbringing in the Fire Nation Palace, where beverages were prepared by servants and consumed without particular attention to their preparation or appreciation, but wisdom that had emerged from his recognition during years of loss and exile, that happiness was not something to be pursued in distant futures or exotic locations, but was available in every present moment to anyone who had developed sufficient mindfulness to recognize the beauty and meaning that ordinary experience contained when approached with proper attention and gratitude. The ritual that transformed simple tea preparation into meditation began before dawn, with the careful selection of water that would serve as foundation for whatever blend he had chosen to prepare that day. The understanding that the quality of this most basic element would influence every subsequent step in the process, and ultimately determine whether the finished tea would honor the leaves that gave their essence to create pleasure for those wise enough to receive what was being offered, with appropriate appreciation and reverence for the gifts that nature provided to consciousness, willing to slow down long enough to notice what was actually available. The heating of water required patience that modern life had trained most people to consider wasteful or unnecessary, but Iroh had learned through years of practice that the temperature reached through gradual warming was different in essential ways from the heat achieved through rapid boiling, that the slow approach created conditions within the water itself that would interact more harmoniously with whatever leaves were chosen for steeping, that rushing this fundamental step would compromise everything that followed, no matter how careful attention might be paid to subsequent stages of the preparation process. The moment when water reached perfect temperature was not something that could be determined through mechanical measurement, but required the kind of sensitivity that developed only through repeated practice and careful observation of subtle changes in sound, steam, and the quality of movement within the vessel that held this most essential of elements. The ear that could distinguish between different stages of heating, the eye that could recognize the precise moment when bubbles indicated readiness rather than excess, the intuition that integrated these various forms of information into knowledge about when to proceed to the next phase. These represented forms of awareness that had nothing to do with intelligence as conventionally understood, but everything to do with presence as spiritual practice. The leaves that would transform heated water into tea were chosen not randomly, but according to wisdom about which varieties would serve the needs and moods of those who would eventually receive what was being prepared with such care and attention. The jasmine that had become Iroh's favorite during his years of travel and exile was selected not just for its delicate fragrance, but for its capacity to calm anxiety while maintaining alertness, to provide comfort without creating drowsiness, to offer subtle pleasure that could be appreciated fully without overwhelming the senses, or creating desire for stronger stimulation that might lead away from the contentment that simple appreciation could provide. The process of combining water and leaves required understanding of proportions that could not be learned from books or instructions, but only through direct experience of how different amounts created different results, how timing influenced flavor in ways that could not be predicted through theory, but only discovered through patient experimentation, guided by willingness to accept failure as teacher rather than disappointment. The tea that was too weak to provide satisfaction and the tea that was too strong to be pleasant both offered lessons about balance, timing, and attention that successful brewing could never teach to consciousness that insisted on immediate mastery rather than gradual development of sensitivity and skill. The steeping process that followed required perhaps the most difficult form of patience, the willingness to wait while transformation occurred in ways that could not be observed directly or hurried through external intervention, to trust that time itself was active ingredient in creating the final result that proper preparation had made possible, but could not guarantee. Without cooperation from processes that unfolded according to their own internal logic, rather than human preference for immediate gratification or control over outcomes that required surrender to natural timing for their proper completion. The pouring that transferred tea from preparation vessel to serving cups was opportunity for practicing the kind of graceful movement that honored what was being shared while creating beauty in the simple act of distribution, the understanding that how something was given influenced its reception as much as what was actually being offered, that the ceremony itself was part of the gift rather than merely preliminary to consumption that represented the real purpose of all the preceding activity and attention. The sharing of tea that completed each ceremony was perhaps its most important aspect because it transformed individual pleasure into communal experience, private satisfaction into opportunity for connection, personal practice into service that honored others, while demonstrating the abundance that came from approaching even simple activities with sufficient care and attention to transform necessity into celebration, routine into ritual, consumption into communion, with forces larger than individual preference or immediate need. The conversations that naturally arose during these tea-sharing sessions were different in quality from discussions that occurred in other contexts because they took place in atmosphere created by shared appreciation of beauty, patience, and attention to present moment experience that made deeper communication possible than the superficial exchanges that characterized most social interaction. The person who had been calmed by tea ceremony was more likely to speak from genuine thought and feeling rather than automatic response, more likely to listen with real attention rather than simply waiting for opportunity to express predetermined opinions or reactions. The silence that often accompanied these sessions was not uncomfortable. Emptiness requiring filling with conversation, but rich presence that allowed appreciation of companionship without need for constant verbal communication, space for reflection and observation that verbal activity might disturb or prevent, opportunity for the kind of shared experience that deepened relationship through simple presence rather than through exchange of information or entertainment that served more obvious social functions but might actually distance people from each other rather than bringing them together. The gratitude that naturally arose during tea ceremony was not forced attitude imposed through religious obligation or philosophical principle, but spontaneous recognition of how many gifts were involved in what appeared to be simple activity. The plant that had grown to provide leaves, the water that had fallen as rain and been collected for use, the fire that provided heat for preparation, the vessels that had been crafted by human hands, the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of tea lovers who had refined techniques through centuries of experimentation and sharing. The mindfulness that tea ceremony cultivated was practical training in presence that could be applied to any activity, any relationship, any moment of daily life, when consciousness chose to engage fully with whatever was actually happening, rather than remaining distracted by mental activity that prevented direct experience of reality as it was actually unfolding. The person who could prepare tea with complete attention could bring the same quality of awareness to conversation, work, walking, eating, or any other activity that daily life required or offered as opportunity for practice. The simplicity that characterized Iroh's approach to tea ceremony was not poverty of imagination or resources, but conscious choice to find richness within basic elements rather than seeking satisfaction through accumulation of exotic ingredients or elaborate equipment that might actually distract from appreciation of essential processes that created meaning and pleasure through attention rather than complexity. The cup that held tea with grace and the pot that poured without dripping were sufficient tools for creating experiences that no amount of expensive accessories could improve if the fundamental understanding of ceremony as spiritual practice was absent. The seasons that influenced Iroh's choice of tea varieties and preparation methods taught lessons about harmony with natural cycles that extended far beyond beverage preferences to encompass entire approaches to living that honored the wisdom of adaptation rather than insisting on consistency, regardless of changing conditions. The lighter teas that served summer's heat and the warming blends that countered winter's cold demonstrated how sensitivity to environment could enhance satisfaction while connecting human activity to larger patterns of change and renewal that made individual life meaningful through participation in processes that extended beyond personal boundaries and preferences. The healing properties that various teas provided were not merely physical effects, but expressions of the connection between consciousness and environment that made wellness possible through cooperation with natural forces rather than opposition to conditions that seemed inconvenient or uncomfortable. The ginger that settled digestion, the chamomile that calmed anxiety, the green tea that provided gentle energy without agitation. Each offered specific gifts that could serve particular needs, while teaching general lessons about how attention to small details of daily life could create conditions for health and happiness that no amount of dramatic intervention could achieve if basic harmony was absent. The economy that tea ceremony represented was not financial calculation, but understanding of how simple pleasures could provide satisfaction that no amount of expensive entertainment or elaborate luxury could match when consciousness was properly prepared to receive what was being offered through practices that cultivated appreciation rather than demanding constant novelty or stimulation that left participants more restless after experience than they had been before, participating in activities that promised fulfillment but delivered only temporary distraction from underlying dissatisfaction. The teaching that occurred during tea ceremony was not formal instruction but transmission of wisdom through example, demonstration of possibilities for finding meaning and pleasure in activities available to anyone regardless of circumstances or resources, proof that contentment was attitude rather than acquisition, practice rather than achievement, choice rather than accident of favorable conditions that might be present today but absent tomorrow depending on forces beyond individual control or prediction. The legacy that Iroh's tea ceremony created was not just personal practice but cultural contribution, demonstration of how ancient wisdom could be adapted to contemporary circumstances, how spiritual practice could be integrated into daily routine, how the sacred could be discovered within the ordinary when approached with sufficient reverence and attention. The people who learned from his example carried these lessons into their own lives and relationships, creating ripples of mindfulness and appreciation that extended far beyond the original teacher and his simple practice of finding infinite richness within the humble act of sharing tea with anyone who had wisdom to receive what was being offered with such patience, care, and love. The wisdom that flowed through Uncle Iroh's approach to teaching was not the kind that demanded attention through impressive displays of knowledge or authority, but the gentle influence that worked like water, wearing smooth channels through stone, persistent and patient, adapting to whatever obstacles it encountered while never losing sight of its ultimate destination or abandoning the fundamental principles that guided its movement through landscapes that might seem hostile to its progress but were ultimately transformed by its consistent presence over time that measured change in seasons rather than moments. The nephew who had arrived in his care as an angry, confused young man desperate for approval from a father incapable of genuine love presented teaching challenges that could not be resolved through conventional methods of instruction, because direct attempts to share wisdom would trigger defensive mechanisms that had been carefully constructed over years of experiencing guidance as weapon, wielded by those who use superior knowledge to control and manipulate rather than empower and liberate those who needed help but feared the vulnerability that came with admitting such need to anyone who might exploit weakness for personal advantage. The approach that Iroh developed through careful observation of Zuko's responses to different forms of interaction was based on understanding that lasting change could not be imposed from outside, but had to emerge from within through processes that honored the student's autonomy, while providing access to insights that could be accepted or rejected according to readiness rather than obligation, creating conditions where growth became natural expression of inner development, rather than compliance with external demands that might produce surface conformity without genuine transformation of understanding or character. The stories that Iroh shared during their travels together were carefully chosen not to illustrate specific moral points or provide obvious lessons, but to plant seeds of possibility in consciousness that was not yet ready to receive direct instruction, but might be open to new ways of thinking through narratives that engaged imagination and emotion rather than triggering intellectual defenses that had been trained to reject anything that seemed like criticism or correction of beliefs and behaviors that had become essential to fragile sense of identity and purpose. The parable about the two lovers who were reborn as dragons spoke to Zuko's situation without addressing it directly, allowing him to consider questions about the nature of destiny, choice, and the possibility that what seemed like curse might actually be opportunity for transformation that could not be achieved through any other means. That separation from comfortable assumptions and familiar roles might be necessary prelude to discovering capabilities and forms of satisfaction that had been impossible while remaining trapped within limitations that had seemed like the protection, but were actually prison walls that prevented growth beyond predetermined boundaries. The tale of the general who learned humility through defeat offered perspective on failure that challenged Fire Nation cultural assumptions about success and worthiness, without directly confronting Zuko's attachment to those assumptions, providing alternative framework for understanding setbacks that might eventually allow him to see his own experiences differently when he developed sufficient emotional distance from immediate pain to consider possibilities that were invisible while wounds remained too fresh for objective evaluation of what had actually occurred and what it might mean for future development. The patience that such teaching required was perhaps its most demanding aspect, the willingness to continue offering guidance to someone who seemed determined to reject everything that was being provided with such care and consistency, to maintain hope for transformation that might take years to manifest while watching choices being made that brought pain to both student and teacher, to trust in processes that operated according to their own timing, rather than human preference for immediate results that would provide reassurance about the effectiveness of methods that might appear unsuccessful to observers who measured progress in weeks rather than seasons. The tea ceremony that became central to their daily routine together was perhaps the most subtle and effective form of teaching that Iroh employed, because it created shared experiences of beauty, patience, and mindfulness without requiring any explicit commitment to values or principles that might have triggered Zuko's resistance to instruction that felt like control or manipulation. The simple act of preparing and sharing tea together taught lessons about timing, attention, respect for process, and the importance of being present to whatever was happening in the current moment, rather than constantly striving toward future goals or dwelling on past failures and disappointments. The questions that Iroh asked were designed not to elicit specific answers, but to encourage reflection and self-examination that might eventually lead to insights that could not be provided through direct instruction, understanding that the most valuable wisdom was that which students discovered for themselves through their own thinking and observation, rather than accepting on authority of teachers who might be wrong or whose insights might not be applicable to circumstances that were unique to individual situations and needs that could not be addressed through generic advice or universal principles that ignored particular contexts. The silence that Iroh maintained during many of their interactions was not absence of teaching, but its most refined expression, the understanding that consciousness often needed space to process and integrate experiences without constant commentary or interpretation that might interfere with natural learning processes, that the most profound lessons were sometimes those that emerged from quiet observation rather than verbal instruction. That presence itself could be a form of guidance that supported growth without directing it toward predetermined outcomes that might be inappropriate for specific individuals and circumstances. The demonstrations that Iroh provided through his own behavior were more powerful than any direct instruction could have been, showing rather than telling what wisdom looked like when embodied in daily life, how principles could be lived rather than simply discussed, how abstract ideals could be transformed into practical approaches to real challenges that arose during their journey together through circumstances that tested every aspect of character and commitment to values that were easy to embrace, in theory, but difficult to maintain when pressures mounted and alternatives seemed more convenient or immediately satisfying. The mistakes that Iroh acknowledged making in his own past served as teaching tools that demonstrated how failure could become foundation for growth rather than evidence of permanent inadequacy, how even wise people continued learning throughout their entire lives, how the goal was not perfection but progress, how shame about past errors could become barrier to future development, if not properly understood and processed through approaches that honored both accountability and self-compassion. as necessary elements in sustainable change and improvement. The protection that Iroh's teaching provided was not the kind that shielded students from all consequences of their choices, but the deeper security that came from developing inner resources that could handle whatever challenges life might present, from learning to trust their own judgment rather than depending on external authorities for every decision, from discovering that mistakes were opportunities for learning rather than disasters that proved fundamental worthlessness or incapacity for growth and positive contribution to the world around them. The encouragement that flowed through every aspect of Iroh's approach to guidance was based on genuine belief in human capacity for transformation and growth, recognition that people were far more capable than they usually believed themselves to be, understanding that confidence developed through experience of success rather than through reassurance that was not supported by actual achievement and demonstration of competence in areas that mattered for happiness and effectiveness in whatever roles life required or offered as opportunities for service and meaningful contribution. The freedom that Iroh's teaching ultimately sought to create was not licensed to do whatever felt good in the moment without regard for consequences, but liberation from internal and external constraints that prevented authentic expression of individual gifts and potentials, from fears and limiting beliefs that kept people smaller than they needed to be, from dependencies on approval and validation that made genuine independence and self-direction impossible to achieve or maintain. Over time, when pressures and temptations arose to abandon hard-won insights in favor of easier paths that promised comfort but delivered only temporary relief from underlying dissatisfaction, the curriculum that emerged from Iroh's years of working with Zuko was not a systematic program that could be replicated exactly with other students, but collection of principles and approaches that could be adapted to serve different personalities, circumstances, and needs, while maintaining commitment to core values that honored student autonomy, while providing access to wisdom that had been tested through real-world application, rather than remaining theoretical knowledge that might sound impressive but prove inadequate when confronted with actual challenges that required practical solutions rather than elegant theories. The transformation that gradually occurred in Zuko demonstrated the effectiveness of teaching methods that respected the student's own timeline and process, rather than imposing external schedules and expectations that might interfere with natural development, that worked with existing strengths and interests, rather than trying to force change in directions that violated essential nature or fundamental values, that created conditions where growth could occur organically, rather than artificially through pressure and manipulation that might produce compliance without genuine understanding or commitment. The loyalty that Zuko eventually developed toward his uncle was not a result of successful manipulation or emotional dependency, but grateful recognition of someone who had cared enough to invest years of patient effort in his development without demanding anything in return, except willingness to consider possibilities that might not have been visible from perspectives limited by pain, anger, and confusion that had been created through previous experiences with authority figures who had used power to harm, rather than help those who were vulnerable enough to trust them, with access to minds and hearts that could be shaped toward wisdom or damaged beyond easy repair. The leadership skills that Zuko developed through his relationship with Iroh were not just practical techniques for managing others, but deeper understanding of how genuine authority was earned through service rather than demanded through position, how influence grew through example rather than through coercion, how respect was gained through consistency and integrity rather than through fear or manipulation that might achieve immediate compliance but created resentment and resistance that would eventually undermine any positive results that force had temporarily achieved through methods that violated human dignity and autonomy. The cycle that Iroh's teaching completed was not just personal but generational, transforming someone who had been damaged by authoritarian approaches to guidance into someone capable of providing the kind of leadership that empowered others rather than diminishing them, that created conditions where people could discover their own capabilities rather than remaining dependent on external direction and validation, that served life rather than serving ego through demonstration of power over others who had no choice but to submit to whatever demands were made upon their time, energy, and commitment to causes that might serve the leader's interests more than the common good that genuine authority was meant to protect and promote. The tea leaves that Uncle Iroh scattered on the wind during one of his final ceremonies were not simply organic matter returning to the earth from which they had grown, but carriers of wisdom that would continue to nurture understanding long after the hands that had prepared them with such care and attention had returned to the elements from which all consciousness temporarily borrowed substance for its brief sojourn in forms that could touch, taste, speak, and love with intensity that made temporary existence worthwhile, despite its inevitable conclusion in transitions that seemed like endings but were actually transformations into new possibilities for service and connection. The legacy that Iroh consciously cultivated during his later years was not monument to personal achievement or collection of accomplishments that would preserve his name in history books, but living influence that would continue to grow and spread through the people whose lives he had touched, whose understanding he had deepened, whose capacity for wisdom and compassion he had nurtured through patient example and gentle guidance that planted seeds capable of producing fruit for generations of beings who would never know the identity of the gardener whose care had made their nourishment possible, but would benefit nonetheless from gifts that love had prepared for futures that individual consciousness could not predict or control. The transformation that Zuko underwent through years of receiving his uncle's unconditional love and patient teaching was perhaps the most visible evidence of how one person's commitment to growth and service could ripple outward to influence entire nations and historical processes, demonstrating that individual choices about how to treat others, how to respond to conflict, how to use whatever power and resources were available, could shape outcomes that extended far beyond the immediate relationships where such choices were made and tested through circumstances that revealed character more clearly than any amount of stated intention or theoretical commitment to noble principles. The Fire Lord who emerged from this relationship was not the angry, desperate young man who had once been willing to do anything to win his father's approval, but someone whose understanding of strength had been fundamentally transformed through exposure to alternative models of leadership that served life rather than serving ego, that empowered others rather than diminishing them, that created conditions where people could discover their own capabilities rather than remaining dependent on external direction and validation that might be withdrawn whenever compliance became inconvenient for those who maintained power, through fear and manipulation rather than through genuine respect and affection. The policies that Zuko implemented as ruler of the Fire Nation reflected lessons learned through years of observing how wisdom could be embodied in daily life, how principles could be lived rather than simply proclaimed, how the gap between stated values and actual behavior could be closed through consistent practice of treating others with dignity and compassion, even when such treatment was not immediately reciprocated or appeared to serve no obvious strategic advantage in competitive environments where kindness was often interpreted as weakness to be exploited by those who mistook cruelty for strength. The reparations program that redirected Fire Nation resources from military expansion to healing the damage that previous generations had inflicted on the other nations was direct expression of Iroh's teaching that true strength came from accepting responsibility for past mistakes while working to repair whatever harm had been caused. That genuine honor required acknowledgement of wrongdoing, followed by sustained effort to make amends through actions that served those who had been harmed rather than those who had caused the harm, regardless of whether such service was appreciated or recognized by those who benefited from it. The cultural exchange initiatives that brought scholars, artists, and spiritual teachers from all 4 nations to the Fire Nation capital were manifestation of Iroh's revolutionary insight that wisdom could be drawn from many different sources, that no single tradition or perspective contained all the truth that consciousness needed for complete understanding, that isolation and superiority were barriers to growth while openness and humility were prerequisites for continued learning and development that could extend throughout entire lifetimes of people who remained curious about possibilities they had not yet explored or integrated into their expanding understanding of reality. The tea houses that began appearing throughout the Fire Nation during Zuko's reign were not merely commercial establishments, but centers for the kind of community building that Iroh had modeled through his simple practice of sharing carefully prepared beverages with anyone who had wisdom to receive what was being offered with such attention to detail and quality, spaces where people from different backgrounds could meet on equal terms, to enjoy simple pleasures while discovering common ground that political and cultural divisions had obscured, but could not eliminate when artificial barriers were removed through deliberate creation of conditions that honored everyone's fundamental humanity. The schools that incorporated meditation and mindfulness practices into their curricula were teaching future generations the kind of inner stability and emotional intelligence that Iroh had demonstrated was essential for navigating life's inevitable challenges without being overwhelmed by circumstances that could not be controlled through external manipulation or force, preparing young minds to find resources within consciousness itself for dealing with whatever difficulties they might encounter, while maintaining connection to sources of meaning and purpose that transcended immediate personal concerns and temporary setbacks. The healing centers that combined traditional Fire Nation medicine with techniques learned from Water Tribe healers, Earth Kingdom, herbalists, and the few remaining practitioners of Air Nomad's spiritual healing represented integration of knowledge that had been scattered by war, but could be reunited through cooperation between people who shared commitment to reducing suffering and promoting well-being regardless of the cultural origins of Norse. Whatever methods proved most effective for serving those who needed help that no single tradition could provide alone. The diplomatic corps that Zuko established was trained not just in negotiation and protocol, but in the kind of genuine cultural appreciation that Iroh had embodied through his ability to find value and wisdom in traditions that seemed foreign or even contradictory to Fire Nation assumptions about proper ways of organizing society, thinking about fundamental questions, and responding to challenges that all human communities faced, regardless of their particular approaches to governance, spirituality, and social organization. The economic development projects that focused on sustainable prosperity rather than resource extraction and exploitation reflected understanding that true wealth came from working with natural systems rather than against them, from creating conditions where all participants could benefit, rather than establishing hierarchies where some prospered at the expense of others, from thinking in terms of long-term consequences rather than short-term gains that might create problems for future generations who would inherit whatever environmental and social damage current choices produced, through prioritizing immediate satisfaction over enduring well-being. The prison reform initiatives that emphasized rehabilitation rather than punishment were direct application of Iroh's teaching that everyone deserved opportunities for growth and change, that past mistakes did not determine future possibilities, that the most effective way to reduce harmful behavior was to address underlying causes rather than simply imposing consequences that might deter specific actions without changing the attitudes and conditions that had made those actions seem reasonable or necessary to people whose circumstances had limited their access to better alternatives. The environmental restoration programs that began healing landscapes damaged by industrial development and military activity were expressions of Iroh's understanding that humans were part of natural systems rather than separate from them, that individual well-being was connected to the health of larger communities that included non-human life forms, whose flourishing was essential for creating conditions where consciousness could develop its highest potentials rather than being trapped in survival mode that prevented growth, beyond meeting immediate physical needs. The artistic renaissance that flourished during Zuko's reign as creators felt free to explore themes and techniques that had been suppressed during the war years, was evidence that Iroh's appreciation for beauty and meaning in everyday experience had influenced cultural development in ways that enriched everyone's life through access to forms of expression that honored the full range of human experience, rather than limiting artistic exploration to propaganda and entertainment that served political purposes, rather than spiritual and emotional needs that art could address when freed from external constraints and expectations. The spiritual revival that emerged as people rediscovered contemplative practices that had been abandoned or forgotten during decades of focusing on material success and military achievement was perhaps the most important aspect of Iroh's legacy, because it addressed fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and transcendence that political and economic reforms alone could never satisfy completely, providing access to sources of fulfillment that did not depend on external circumstances for their availability or effectiveness in creating the kind of inner peace that made all other forms of progress sustainable and beneficial rather than ultimately self-defeating. The influence that Iroh's example had on ordinary citizens who had never met him personally, but were inspired by stories of his transformation from aggressive general to wise teacher, demonstrated how genuine wisdom could spread through culture in ways that formal education or political propaganda could never achieve, creating changes in attitude and behavior that emerged from authentic recognition of what served life versus what served ego, what created lasting satisfaction versus what provided temporary distraction from underlying dissatisfaction that no amount of external success could permanently resolve. The children who grew up during this period of cultural transformation would carry forward into their own adulthood and leadership roles, understanding of how strength and gentleness could be integrated, how individual development and community service could support each other, how spiritual practice and practical responsibility could be unified rather than treated as competing demands on time and attention that consciousness possessed in limited quantities, creating foundations for continued social evolution that honored both human potential and planetary well-being as inseparable aspects of sustainable civilization. The letters that visitors from other nations wrote home about their experiences in the transformed Fire Nation spoke of encountering people who had learned to hold power lightly, to exercise authority with humility, to pursue prosperity without greed, to maintain pride in their heritage without needing to diminish others' accomplishments, demonstrating that the lessons Iroh had taught through patient example could be scaled up from individual relationships to entire cultures when enough people committed to embodying wisdom rather than simply talking about it during convenient moments that required no sacrifice or fundamental change, in comfortable patterns of thinking and behaving. The peace that gradually spread throughout the four nations as Zuko's approach to governance inspired similar transformations in other capitals was not merely absence of military conflict, but positive condition of mutual support and creative collaboration that made everyone's life richer and more meaningful than what any nation could achieve through isolation or dominance. Proof that Iroh's vision of balance and integration was not naive idealism, but practical wisdom about how conscious beings could organize themselves to serve life rather than serving death, to create rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm the conditions that made flourishing possible for current and future generations. And so we reach the end of our gentle journey through the wisdom of Uncle Iroh, the man who discovered that the greatest victories were won not through conquest, but through compassion, not through force, but through understanding, not through taking, but through giving freely of whatever gifts consciousness had been blessed to receive and refine through years of patient practice in the ancient arts of love and service to life itself. The tea that steams in your imagination as these words fade into silence carries within it all the lessons we have shared together. The patience that transforms bitter experiences into nourishment for growth, the balance that finds harmony within apparent contradiction, the hope that persists even in darkness, the forgiveness that heals both giver and receiver, the love that brightens whatever circumstances it encounters with warmth that no external condition can diminish or destroy. As you drift toward peaceful rest, carry with you the image of Uncle Iroh's gentle smile, his understanding eyes, his hands that prepared tea with such care for anyone wise enough to accept what was being offered. Let his voice whisper through your dreams the eternal truth that every ending is also beginning, every loss an opportunity for deeper appreciation of what remains, every challenge an invitation to discover resources within consciousness that difficulty alone can reveal and develop into practical wisdom. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the space between waking and dreaming, Uncle Iroh sits waiting with a perfect cup of jasmine tea, ready to share whatever comfort weary souls require for their continued journey toward the light that shines eternally within every heart, courageous enough to remain open to love's infinite possibilities.